So thank you all for being here. This is the last coughing conversation of the semester, and for the time being anyway, we're not quite sure what we're going to do in the fall semester, but we're pretty excited about this one. Thank you all for coming to the series. It's been wonderful. Learned a lot. This is the 10th and last one, so really appreciate you hanging with us. And I think today is going to be a great way to conclude the series because Kristen, Hassmiller Lich, our speaker, is going to be circling us back to the very first thing we talked about, which is the interjection of systems within transportation and engineering and how it is that we can start to look at these complex and dynamic systems from a different way that maybe will help us identify some solutions. So I'd like to introduce our speaker. Kristen Hassmiller Lich got her bachelor's at the University of Akron and then her master's and PhD in public health at the University of Michigan. She's an associate professor at the Gillings School of Public Health here at UNC, where she researches operations research applications to complex systems. She looks at econometric models for health issues. She looks at tuberculosis research, mental health research, tobacco use research. She's very multidisciplinary, very well learned and well spoken on a lot of different topics. And honestly, we think she's awesome. She's helped us a lot with system stuff. And she's the system science inaugural scholar. So we're really fortunate to have her here today. So Kristen, if you will take it away.
All right, it's very exciting to be here also. Let me see if I can hold this. Okay, got to get the technology worked out and then we will get started. Can you? Can you advance here? Okay, great. All right. The human side of fixing technology. All right, so it's really exciting to be here today. I have packed way too much into these slides, and I apologize for that in advance. I will try to give us a nice focus story, but know that these slides are available if you want to read more or just contact me about anything that we kind of go too fast through. But I want to start out by really talking about the application we've been working on, just a little bit, pedestrian fatalities. And really talk about how we're using system science methods to really try to begin understanding this trend and getting underneath this trend. So I want to give you a glimpse of what it looks like under the hood. And the reason this is so kind of put together with lots of slides is that this is really an active construction zone. We're really just getting this project started. How many of you have been involved in some of our project group model building sessions? Okay, a couple of familiar faces. Okay, so first for you, some of this is going to be a little bit of a repeat. I apologize for that. But I want to give everyone a sense of kind of the what and why, what system science looks like, why we're doing this, and really a little bit start to place the method that we're using, system dynamics, in the broader context of systems methods. So next slide. Let's start out by just looking at the data on the problem. So what we really want to begin to understand is why are pedestrian fatalities, both the number and the rate, which were going down for quite a while gradually. Why did they start to kick up in 2008, 2009? What's underneath that trend? And what was sort of suspected when we started working on this was that if you ask 10 different people what's underneath that, they all know, and they all give you 10 different answers. So it's a challenge to really figure out what's underneath this, and we want to make sure that we really have a better sense before we start investing in action to address it. So next slide. But why? Why is this trend going up? I'll tell you where this came from in a minute, but what I want to just kind of point out is these 10 different people and 10 different hypotheses. This is a lot of what we would hear. We'd hear distraction's the problem, poor pedestrian infrastructure, just more people walking, economic activity, speed. Hopefully you'll see something in here that your brain went to right away. These are the kinds of things that we started to hear when we asked for people's hypotheses. So next slide. All right. What we tend to do as humans really is to see a problem and try to quickly get to a solution, to really figure out how we can address that problem. We had a template. Well, okay, let's talk about this. So what are some, when we think about pedestrian fatalities, what jumps to mind? What have you all heard about this?
That it's the driver's fault.
That it's the driver's fault, right? So what should we do about it?
I don't know, or maybe the pedestrian, depending on the situation, like if they were jaywalking.
Right, right. There were a couple of news stories in Chapel Hill not too long ago. It was two people crossing in a certain spot on MLK, right? They were homeless, so maybe that's what we've got to be working on. I think we're hardwired to really try to see problems and get those problems addressed. And so in systems thinking, we often use this iceberg analogy. We see events poking up from the water, and we want to try to really address them. But what we want to do with system science methods is really get under the water a little bit deeper and understand what's going on. So what that might look like, what we as far as we tend to go, is really starting to look at patterns, those trends, what's happening, trends over time, variation across geography, and really try to see if we can start to get some hints about what's going on to anticipate it, to develop better action. So that's better. We're getting lower down. Before I go too far, though, and what do I mean by system? I don't know how much, so again, let me ask, what pops to your mind when I say system? We're doing systems thinking, system science. What is system?
Multiple pieces connected somehow.
Yeah, multiple pieces connected. There was something over here?
Integrated.
Integrated, great.
Different pieces that integrate together.
Yeah, things put together. I like these answers. Anything else that jumps to mind? Yes.
The environment that whatever you're looking at is situated in.
I love it. The environment in which the problem or whatever we're studying is situated, right? So I love that. So often when I ask that question, folks will say something like an organization, the federal government is a system, or the human body is a system. They've got parts that function together to produce some outcomes. And that's right. But often when we're trying to address a problem like pedestrian fatalities, I want you to think about a system as all of the relevant interconnected things, laws, people, organizations, forces, characteristics of the environment that are really sort of producing those trends that we care about. So when I say systems thinking, system science, that's what I mean by system. It's really trying to see the whole, to really see what is most important in determining an outcome that we care about. Okay, so next slide. And really what we're trying to do is get even further down that iceberg and start to understand the structure of the system. What's important in the environment? What's important in our organizations? What's important with our laws, with our sort of cultural norms? What's important in terms of how we're seeing the outcomes that we're seeing? It's trying to go beyond just putting Band-Aids on cuts. We're trying to really understand and anticipating. It's good to look at trends and try to anticipate, but we're trying to understand why we're seeing what we're seeing so that we can develop actions that are really better aligned with the system that are going to really drive more sustainable, more impactful change. Okay, next slide. So what makes this really hard? There's a couple of words that I want to constructs that I want to introduce here, because I think many of these are relevant to pedestrian fatalities and probably other really persistent challenges that you face. So the first is detail complexity. So problems can be really hard because they've got lots of parts. So the interconnected parts of a system, detail complexity really means that there's a lot of parts. There's a lot going on. Now, fortunately, we can, like a car, we can break it into its components, study the pieces, understand how the pieces work, understand how to put them back together, and the car should run pretty well. Not saying it's easy, but it's hard because of the detail. And another example of detail complexity, relevant for pedestrian fatalities, next slide, is the human body, right? There's a lot of pieces, there's a lot of things going on, but we can study parts and start to understand how the whole functions. There's another type of complexity, though, that I want us to be thinking about a little bit because I think it's really relevant to pedestrian fatalities. And that's what we call dynamic complexity. Next slide. Okay.
Yeah, you
can go one more. Okay. That one got to the animation.
Okay.
All right. So dynamic complexity has a couple of characteristics. So the first is that there are a web of interconnected factors. If we want to understand pedestrian fatality, there's probably a lot of things going on here. And if we study one thing in isolation, we're probably kind of missing some of those interconnections that may really matter. There's a lot going on, a lot that could be important, and we've got to really start to study these pieces and understand how they interconnect. Next slide. Another characteristic of dynamic complexity is that we have these feedback loops. So when something changes, it triggers a ripple effect. It triggers another change, and that change triggers another change, which triggers another change. And so these ripple effects can be really substantial and meaningful. Sometimes they kind of circle back around to really either reinforce that earlier change or to counteract that earlier change, either driving sort of exponential growth, like diffusion of an innovation into a market, or to bring balance to kind of counteract change. In a lot of circumstances, our systems are very resilient. We just think about drug markets and how resilient. You close one sort of opportunity of how things work, and it pops up another place, right? So there's really often very strong either reinforcing or balancing feedback loops in our systems. These ripple effects that circle back around with some time, take some time. It could be fast, some are fast, some of them are a lot slower. Here's an example of one. So we could start reading this anywhere. So if anything triggers a change in here, let's just say pedestrian, so the pedestrian exposure. So the more pedestrians there are on a street, it's going to trigger an increase in perceived attentiveness required. Drivers are going to sort of take notice and try to be a little bit more attentive because they feel like there are likely to be pedestrians in this place. So perceived attentiveness required goes up. Hopefully, attentiveness goes up. By the way, I'm reading these as ripple effects. A change in this triggers a change in the next variable, all else equal. The S's and O's on the arrows tell us whether the variables move in the same direction. So if this goes up, it's going to trigger an increase in this, up, or down. And the O means opposite. So perceived attentiveness required goes up. Hopefully, the attentiveness goes up, which means that the number of crashes should go down, right? Crashes go down, pedestrian deaths go down. What happens? Starts to feel a little bit safer. This is safety in numbers. Pedestrian deaths go down, more pedestrians start walking there. And that means that there's more pedestrian exposure, which over time is going to increase the attentiveness. So this is a reinforcing feedback loop wherein over time, but this is really the dominant feedback loop, over time what's happening is this idea of safety in numbers. So if we can trigger pedestrian exposure leading to more attentiveness, decreasing crashes, bringing more people to walk in an area, it can reinforce this idea that this is a safe place to walk. Now, that might be going on, that might be important. It's probably not the only thing that's going on, but starting to see feedback loops, if they exist, is important because these turn out to be very, very powerful sort of forces determining outcomes over time. Because it's not just like one change triggers another change, it's that it keeps happening over time to either, in this case, reinforce more sort of safety and more people walking in an area, or to counteract something that we may or may not want. So sometimes they're good, whether they're good or bad depends on sort of what's going on, but starting to see these circles, see these feedback loops is important only when they really have an important impact on the outcomes that we care about. So next slide. Another hallmark of dynamic complexity, again, this web of interconnected factors, feedback loops. Another is nonlinear relationships. So here's a classic example of nonlinear relationships. So the relationship between speed that cars travel and the likelihood that the pedestrian, if there's a crash, is going to be injured or killed is not linear. Okay, so that has ramifications for how we ought to try to get underneath this trend in pedestrian fatalities. Okay, so these are really three of the important hallmarks of dynamic complexity, different than detailed complexity. There can be dynamic complexity in incredibly simple, otherwise simple systems. If they've got these kind of dynamics, sometimes they're quick, sometimes they're slow. Nonlinear relationships and a sort of web of interconnected factors. Okay, next slide. So we can keep going. When we start with this feedback thinking, we keep going. And so here's another example of a loop that I placed on top of the loop we just talked through. So here's that safety in numbers loop on the outside. Okay, but there's another loop going on. So what happens if we have more pedestrians in an area? Yes, it will over time increase pedestrian exposure and trigger driver attentiveness, but more pedestrians, everything else equal, is going to lead to more crashes. And more crashes is going to lead to more pedestrian deaths, which is going to decrease pedestrians. So now what we have is two feedback loops going on at the same time. One that's really trying to trigger is safety in numbers, but as more people start coming out, there's more crashes, and that's going to undermine this other feedback loop. So if we start to think about the feedback loops, well, my first question is, which one of these is likely to be dominating what happens? Which one's likely to be faster, more powerful? What do you all think?
Increase exposure.
Say it again.
I was going to increase exposure. Well, more pedestrians leading to more crashes.
This
The
one,
pedestrians, I think that would,
that this one's going to happen faster.
yeah.
Yeah, and perhaps just very sensational. I mean, it might really undermine this.
Yeah.
Anybody have a different thought? That was my gut feeling, was that if we start to get more people out, I think this is a little bit slower. I think it's likely to take a little bit more time to really signal, first of all, to signal that more people can walk, and to get drivers to be attentive of it. I worry a little bit that this might take some learning, take some time, but this just takes one accident, one crash, sorry, and it could undermine a lot of what's been going on out here. And in reality, there's probably more feedback loops going on. But when we think about it this way, it gets us to look at the data differently. It gets us to think about how we would research this differently, how we would address this with action and policy differently. What can we do here? If we start to identify these feedback loops, what can we do here to try to let that outer loop dominate? How can we strengthen that outer loop? It's a different way of thinking. But just like with any other model that we build, we need to really test this, test it against the data, and really make sure that it represents a valid hypothesis. Okay, next slide. Oh yes, I'm sorry.
Can we go back to the
Sure.
loops?
Yep. Oh, there you go.
So if we're thinking the small loop on the right
Yep.
would undermine the one on the left.
Yes.
Is the small loop on the right self-reinforcing, or is that self-correcting?
I think so. This is a balancing loop. So basically, what's going to happen is it's going to constrain the number of pedestrians. Let's read through it and make sure that it makes sense, because this is a really, if I can leave you kind of understanding how to think about this diagram, I think that's a good step. So if we have more pedestrians, meaning more crashes, it's just more exposure, right?
Right.
More crashes, more deaths.
Right.
Right. Probability. Yeah. More deaths, fewer pedestrians.
Right.
So what's going to happen here is that we're counteracting, we're bringing balance to this. So if more pedestrians started to walk, we're going to kind of bring this under control because the deaths will start to kind of work against that, and the other way around, which is what I think you're thinking about. We need to read it both ways. So if there are fewer pedestrians, right? So the balance has triggered a decrease in pedestrians. That's going to decrease crashes, which is going to decrease pedestrian deaths. No visibility of it. Suddenly, people kind of forget. They start to walk more. Right.
So it seems like the net impact of the one on the right, since that's bounded. Yep. That's overall not going to really affect the bigger loop.
Well, what this is going to do is try to, we see kind of like, bounding, kind of maybe a little bit of oscillation around a stable sort of steady point. So this is really going to constrain the growth in this. Yeah, so it's not that it's going to remove pedestrians from an area, but it's going to restrain the growth in pedestrians that we would get from this outer loop. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. That was a great question. So balancing loops try to move towards some steady state. Reinforcing loops try to push for growth up or down. Okay, and again, whether it's good or bad depends on what's going on here, but this reinforcing loop would be good if we really want to get people out walking, and getting drivers to be careful of people walking in a given area. We might be able to get above some threshold where the attentiveness is really sort of ingrained and it becomes habit. Who knows? Yeah, but that was a great question. Okay, everybody okay with this? Does that make sense? Okay, great. Next slide. Another characteristic of problems that can make them really hard that I think is also present here is this word wicked. Sometimes we hear wicked problems. And what this really means to me is that a problem is wicked if you've got a lot of different ways that we can think about the problem. And what is the problem? Is the problem too much distraction? Is the problem, and what is the problem? And even there might be some disagreement about whether there even is a problem. You know, do we really need to care about this? We could just kind of explain it away. You know, and I think part of what's going on here is that we have a lot of people, even if we think about the pedestrian fatalities trend and sort of what's underneath that, we have a little bit of this. A lot of people thinking that different components of this are the problem and to varying degrees of a problem. But we also have other people that really care about things like getting more pedestrians out to walk, and they might not, or ride bikes, if becoming physically active. We may not be thinking about this risk and how these sort of outcomes co-mingle. So I think we've got a little bit of that going on too. Next slide. And so when we go back to this iceberg, as a result of this, there's another layer that we want to make sure that we consider. Next slide. And that's really understanding people's mindsets or mental models, sort of what they think, what they value, why they value it, what biases they have. Because often the well-intentioned people working on one initiative or with a focus on one outcome that's more narrow might sort of create a change, trigger some change that is relevant and might undermine what we're doing over here. Often the outcomes that we see in systems really are sort of perpetuated by our flawed, our imperfect, our too narrow mental models, well-intentioned. So has anyone heard the phrase sort of the system's broken? Right? The system's broken, we're getting terrible outcomes. But really, you know, what I want you guys to be thinking about here is the system's not broken. What's going on is that the system is what it is. The system is designed to produce these outcomes that we're getting. And so if those outcomes are not desirable, we need to start to question why. What are we doing that is allowing those to be perpetuated? Question not only sort of exposures in the environment, but also our beliefs, our values, our sort of how we interact to try to address problems. Okay, next slide. So system science really is a set of methods. There's some qualitative methods, there's some quantitative methods, there's some mixed methods. I threw some examples up here, not to go into each one, but just to get some language in front of you. But there are a whole variety of methods, and what these are really all about they're about seeing holes, seeing the whole, trying to understand the system in a very structured way. And they are not meant to replace other methods that we have. We should not stop doing all of the great work that we're doing, but we need to remember that in addition to that, we want to take some time to kind of step back and really see the whole, put the pieces together, play out the scenarios, and really try to think about how we're going to address some of these problems, particularly if they are plagued by the detailed complexities, the dynamic complexities, the sort of wickedness about disagreement about what to even focus on. We need to start to use some of these methods. Okay, next slide. And again, really, really what this is about when we're doing system science, no matter what method, we're sort of zooming in, zooming out. We're remembering to kind of step back on the 10,000 foot level and see the forest, and to study the trees that are sort of embedded within it, right? So we're zooming in, zooming out. We try to see broadly what could be going on, and then you zoom in and really try to test some of the pieces of that hypothesis. Really learn about what components of what people think may be important is important. And then we zoom back out, and we try to think about, taking what we learned back to this broader level and think about, well, what are we going to do about this to get underneath the pedestrian fatalities trends? How do we get underneath this? So it's zooming in, zooming out to really try to learn in the face of complexity without getting overwhelmed by it, and really trying to bring in knowledge from the variety of data sources that we have. These models that we're developing, whether they're qualitative, quantitative, they really are our hypotheses about how outcomes are affected, and we want to keep testing them. We want to test them against data. We want to test them against other theory and knowledge. Okay, so next slide. So we are in this project using a system science method called system dynamics, which is particularly useful when we have the dynamic complexity. So dynamics, delays, interconnected factors, feedback loops, nonlinear relationships. Because it turns out that in the context of dynamic complexity, our intuition is particularly bad. It's really hard to kind of intuit how dynamics are going to play out over time. And so in that case, in that context, not in all contexts, but in this context where there's dynamic complexity, it makes sense to really use models to help us, to really support our intuition, to help us learn. So the models, really what they're about are just trying to trigger, well, we think that this is important and it triggers this. But then when that changes, it triggers this. It's trying to take the pieces of our knowledge, put it together, and use simulation to kind of play them out like a flight simulator to help us really learn. So this method really grew out of control engineering. So it was used first in sort of business and industry to control supply chains. But has been used and applied since the 60s, 70s to a variety of other issues, population growth, a variety of applications in health, and we're now starting to apply it to pedestrian fatalities. So what this is really all about, in my mind, I think this is a great graphic, is that we're trying to see holes, we're trying to really understand what the determinants are in a very multi-dimensional way. We want to influence indirectly, meaning really support learning, and also really try to work toward aligning values to the extent that different stakeholders addressing this problem might have different values. We want to try to help them learn and try to figure out how we can find better actions that are sort of sustainable and are best situated amidst the complexity. And we want to really assess significance. We want to really try to use this understanding to think through what the impact of our actions is likely to be, different actions, before we really invest in the wrong things, learn the hard way. So next slide. So here's a great quote by Peter Senge. Has anyone read The Fifth Discipline? Yep. Okay, great. So it's a good read. It's meant to try to make system dynamics very friendly and really to try to bring sort of the ideas within the method to life. And here's a nice quote. Take a minute to read it. I'm going to grab my time check. Okay. Okay, but I really just want to emphasize here that we're really good at adding to the complexity, trying to fix problems here and there, and we just kind of change things. And so it's really trying to. This method is really about trying to pause and again, it's probably good that we're doing a lot of those piecewise things, but we need to pause and think about sort of the big picture as well, and really trying to understand sort of what's leading to change. What are the important sort of interconnecting factors that are leading to change when it's undesirable? How do we get underneath it? How do we think about sort of aligning action to what is the system that's sort of causing undesirable outcomes? Next slide. Okay, and this is really kind of how I think about what system dynamics is. So up here at the top, okay, so we have the real world, which might have problems in it, and we get some sort of information. We get some sort of information that we use to make decisions, take some action, take some policy, make an intervention, which is going to change the world. We get some, we implement something, we do an evaluation, we get some information back, okay? And what do we do after we get that information back? We tend to just kind of go right back into the next decision, and we keep going around. And this is what we call single loop learning up on the top, okay? We just, we might spend a little bit of time studying. This is strategy, structure, decision rules down here on the bottom. We might spend a little bit of time studying, but often it's early into a project. And we feel like we know what's going on, make a decision, evaluate it, get information, make another decision, keep going. Okay, what we want to try to do is start to head down into double loop learning. There's a couple of other pieces here that are really important. So right here, there's a loop here between information feedback and mental models. And what's important about that is that our mental models, right, our ideas about sort of what's underneath the problem could come from our disciplinary training. They might be shaped by biases, sort of just human nature, the desire to get to solutions. It could be there's all sorts of things that go on in our mental models. Again, this idea that with dynamic complexity, our intuition's often wrong, but it's with these mental models that we're processing this information, that we're interpreting that information and making decisions. And so we want to spend some time here improving our mental models. Okay, so it's important to recognize that our mental models inform how we process information, what we see in it, what we test, what hypotheses we test in it, but also what data we collect. Right? We may not even be collecting the right information. And so wanting to really spend some time understanding people's mental models so that we can gather the right information and that we can really support learning. If we can influence these mental models, it's going to get us to make better decision rules, to establish better decision rules, better sort of heuristics, so that we can make better decisions, okay? And really what double loop learning is all about is as we make decisions after sort of seeing data, questioning our mental models, improving our sort of understanding of the world. I often think about this as our simulation models. These are the models that we're building. They're informed by our mental models. They have the data, okay, that comes all through here. But we want to inform our models so that we can use them to make better decisions. Our actions are going to change the environment. We'll get the right data, okay? Try to check our mental models, improve our decision models. My idea about the investment in system dynamics modeling in the qualitative diagrams that we build and the simulation models that we build is that they represent our hypotheses, our best current working understanding of what's really determining outcomes of interest. And they should be alive, they should be dynamic because we want to keep testing them so that over time we're going to sort of throw out versions of hypotheses that aren't aligned with the data and start moving toward those that really seem to be most consistent with the data. Because the more we can get these hypotheses tested and improved, the better our decisions are going to be. And what's really challenging is that the problem with dynamic complexity, things are not often static. They're often changing over time. We're going to get new technology. The roads are going to change. We're going to get cars with different safety features. And so we need to not let our hypotheses, our theories be stagnant either. We've got to keep learning and improving them. So double loop learning is really all about trying to make sure that when we intervene, when we do something, that we don't just cycle back around and show that it worked, but that we really try to loop back in and test our hypotheses, our models, our theories, to really see whether what we learned supports them, and if not, that's great because it gives us information to again improve our models. But we need to take the time to do that. And I think really, in what a lot of my work, what I care a lot about is trying to make these models accessible, transparent, so that others can continue to test them as well. And that's how I think we're going to advance our understanding of what is going on with pedestrian fatalities. There's a number of other dynamically complex problems. Okay, next slide. All right, so I want to talk about what it looks like to do this work. So we have recently started, we've got a small project grant. Laura and Becky are PIs on this. And we're really trying to start with the mental models part of it. Because if we, there's a lot of data. So if we went to the data and started looking at pedestrian fatalities, there's a lot that we could look at, and we wanted some guidance. There's also a lot of literature that we can look at too. So we wanted some guidance, some direction. We wanted to really understand the mental models that experts come in a variety of forms. We had a lot of different disciplinary researchers. We had a lot of practitioners come together. And really talk to us about what they thought was underneath this increasing trend in pedestrian fatalities. So we had 2 sessions where we brought together about, how many people? 35 people, and some of you were there, and really tried to tap mental models and draw out what some of these really important dynamics are, what these important hypotheses are that you all thought, that folks thought were likely underneath pedestrian fatality trends that we're seeing. And so that's the first step, is to really try to see what's there. Now that we've got these hypotheses, we're starting to really process them and kind of hear what the key themes are. We're trying to sort of vet those against data. Let's bring data in and compare. Let's bring literature in and really try to test these and refine them. And that's the process that we're in right now. So here's who we had in the room when we started with the mental models. Just step 1, next slide. Okay, the first thing that we did, and this is now I can tell you where this word cloud comes from. The first thing we did was we asked everybody to just right away tell us what they thought the 3 important factors are that are really underlying this increasing trend in pedestrian fatalities. And this is really what we heard. So I took that data and made a word cloud pardon all the hyphens, but it was the only way to keep things together. So this is what we heard. When we start to just list variables, this is what we got from folks. Next slide. Okay, messy, crazy messiness. The next thing that we did was we started to teach people how to draw causal loop diagrams. So like the one that I showed you earlier, the two sort of embedded feedback loops. We started out by talking about a different example, so heist students' grades, and what are the factors that really influence students' grades for better and worse? What are the consequences of students' grades? Are there any balancing or reinforcing feedback loops? Just to try to get folks, give them a chance to practice thinking using causal loop diagramming. And so then after that, what we did was we, okay, next slide. After that, what we did was that we gave them an individual opportunity to draw their own mental models, their own in the form of a causal loop diagram of what really matters, what really triggers change in pedestrian fatalities over time. What are some of the important sort of factors that are driving change, and what are consequences of change, and to try to really start to think about balancing and reinforcing feedback loops. And we got, so from everybody, we got a diagram. And then after folks had a chance to really draw their own diagram and talk about it with a partner, to start to appreciate how different their mental models were from each other and ways in which they were similar, we grouped folks into small groups of like 4 to 5 and really gave folks a chance to start to think together about what really matters to drive pedestrian fatalities. So next slide. Got a couple of photos here just so you can start to see this. So again, here, road user attentiveness. Somebody a group did a deep dive on that, really trying to think about what affects attentiveness. Next slide. Here we see quality of infrastructure in urban areas. Somebody did a deep dive there. A group did a deep dive trying to really understand what shapes that. Okay, what consequences of changing that are, and feedback loops. Next slide. And again, I'm going super fast through these just because I want to give you a flavor for this, but know that these slides are available. All right, so here were some key themes and insights that really emerged from this session, and we got this from sort of stakeholder evaluations. So perspectives on the nature of the issues and solutions changed after the workshop. So when we asked people what were some of the most important factors before and after, we definitely start to see some change, increasing sort of calling out of interconnections, not just sort of single variables, and the factors changed. So significant interest in better studying the role of, these are kind of areas where we got a lot of deep dives and questions to really start to dig into the data more. So changes in vehicle design, height, weight, and in-vehicle technology, personal technology, and really trying to see how those trends might align with some of the different trends in pedestrian fatalities, roadway design changes, particularly affecting speed setting, etc. Impairment in connection with broader social issues, changes in travel behaviors and exposure, changes to policy, social, environmental conditions that have affected the least advantaged populations. So there's some sense that urbanization and kind of there's a lot going on that's affecting differentially people of different sort of social location, and that we need to really try to understand why to get underneath that part of it too. Strong desire for data at a finer grain. So here was a quote: trend lines at the national level don't tell us anything about what's happening locally. So really trying to, wanting to, and I think this is right, start to understand sort of what these trends look like locally and across localities. And acknowledging the limitations of existing data, telling the full story. There's a lot of data out there, but it's not always what we want. So I think part of the benefit of doing this is that we're asking different questions of our data and hopefully really kind of pushing on the data. And that may influence what we collect and therefore, what we learn in our mental models. Next slide. Just a couple of other sort of insights from the session. Participants appreciated the complexity of the issue more. Tended to be very open to the method, and though it can make our heads hurt, I think we had a conversation in one of the sessions about realizing how hard this issue really is and entering what was the word we used, the depths of despair, the depths of despair in terms of our ability to get underneath this, but then hopefully coming out the other side after we start to simplify, our understanding. It feels, when you start into systems thinking, often you realize how complex the issue is, and it just feels daunting. But gradually, sort of with a little bit more effort, once you start to dig in and iterate, it starts to feel a little bit more specific. We start to have a better sense of what really matters, and that's where we're heading. But you don't know that until you start to explore the sort of bigger world of possibilities. That's the sort of zooming in, zooming out. Okay, next slide. So, and again, there's a lot here, and we will be kind of giving more of this over time, but this is right now our working sort of our working sort of version, cleaned up version of some of the really important feedback loops that were uncovered amongst our groups. In here, you'll see a couple that I showed you already. So the perceived attentiveness required, attentiveness, crashes, pedestrian exposure, that's in there. But some other variables that are really important and connected in here: pedestrian infrastructure, funding, expected pedestrian deaths, affecting funding. Let's see, speed, law enforcement as an ability to try to address speed. Over here, industry development of crash prevention technology, unsafe use of technology. These were some of the really important factors that we kept hearing over and over again that were really embedded in these balancing and feedback loops. Again, the question is this what's most important? Which of these loops are really dominating? Where, when, why? And what are we going to do to try to get underneath this?
Kristen, the double brackets are a time delay, right?
Yes, great question. I didn't introduce that. So the last sort of piece of these puzzle diagrams that I didn't introduce is the delay mark. That's that little hash mark here. What that signals is that we think that ripple effect, that change triggering more change, is slower, is like an order of magnitude slower than some of the other ripple effects. And so that affects, the likelihood that loop is really going to be dominating. So the delays indicate that there is a connection, but it's slower. Great question. And again, I just put a lot up here, but I wanted to give you a sense of sort of what this is starting to look like. Next slide. All right. But what needs to happen now is going on is that we need to start vetting this, like looking at the data with these hypotheses in mind and starting to really test. We're sort of kind of right now data gathering. We're cleaning up these mental models, starting to compare them to the literature and starting to really compare them to the data. So here, so I just want to go through several slides where I kind of walk through some of the data that we're kind of processing, which I think gives us some different thoughts about what the key dynamics are likely to be. So here we see that there are changes happening. So the blue line is the pedestrian injuries. They're fairly flat, but the pedestrian deaths are going up. So it could be that that's part of a hint at sort of what really is underneath the waterline, what's at the bottom of the iceberg. Next. Okay, so, to go ahead and click through all, there's like 3, yeah, there we go. So there's a bunch of, potential theories that came out of some of our brainstorming and diagramming. So higher crash energy, nature of the impact, comorbidity, post-crash response could all be sort of underneath that. So we need to start testing these things. Next slide. Vehicle miles traveled came up a lot. And again, it's not ruled out, but when you look at the data, the trend doesn't quite align with the trend line that we saw earlier for pedestrian fatalities. This has been going up the whole time. So another feedback loop that came up from the mental models was that vehicle miles traveled, so more cars is going to lead to more cars on the road, more congestion, which would reduce speeds. And in some places, that might actually increase safety, right? Because slower speeds, less likelihood of a crash. If there's a crash, it's less likely to be a fatal one. Okay, so some hypothesis there that this may not actually be what's underneath that. But again, it needs to be looked at more carefully and probably at a finer grain level than nationally. Next slide. All right, this is an important data to look at as well. And so here, changing vehicle fleet. So we are seeing our bend in the curve of pedestrian fatalities happen around 2009, about the same time that we started to see an uptick in the light duty, the trucks. So, I think, and again, this is an example of dynamics, because if we buy vehicles that are more likely to lead to fatal crashes, these cars are in the market for some time. Right, so the data on when they're bought isn't necessarily what's going to align with our increase in pedestrian fatalities. We need to start to think about the prevalence of these cars in the in sort of out there in our communities rather than just the purchase of them. So next slide. Let me check in on time because okay, I'm going to go fast through these. I just want to really kind of point out some of the themes here. But again, looking at other indicators, so human resilience to injury, we're seeing a rising senior population. So in the mental models, aging also came out. We're seeing a rising trend in opioid use, which has ramifications both for crashes, but also survival of continued increase in other comorbidities. And so what we're seeing here is the aging of the population. So that could be a big part of, well, either side of this, the driving side, the walking side, but the fatality conditional on crash. Next slide. And the sharpest fatal increases are among people aged 50 to 69. So it might start to point us to trying to understand some of the dynamics there. Next slide. And we need to keep paying attention to structures driving change. So here we have a map where we're seeing a lot of these are factors again that came up in our in the group model building. Labor infrastructure, the gig economy, overall impacts on poverty, housing, sort of urbanization, the shifting of where people are living and walking in places that maybe weren't designed to be walkable. Extreme weather events are changing a lot of things. Housing, vehicle prices, homelessness. And these changes above relate to mental health, how we travel, when we travel, exposure to risks and different safety behaviors. And so we need to start digging into these as well. Next slide. And again, I really think it's important to get underneath that waterline, to really start to look at trends, patterns by geography, and dynamics for hints of what's going on at a finer grain level. So here we're seeing 3-year average crash rates, and there's variation across the country. Next slide. And when we look at sort of changes over a 5-year period, that when we take that snapshot, so if we look at it from 07 to 11 to 12, it matters. So here we're starting to see this uptick. So again, trying to see where things vary. Next slide. Okay. So I just want to remind us about a lot of data, and I want to really reiterate that the mental models, the mental model elicitation, where we got our stakeholders, our experts together, was the first step. The second step is really trying to test those against the data. And we're trying to build up our understanding, our better understanding of what's really driving these pedestrian fatality trends that we're seeing in the form of a model. So next slide. There's a lot going on here, but I just want to point you to, I wanted to give a sense of what this can look like, what the models can look like that sort of are derived at the end of this. And so all of the focus on sort of zero fatalities. Saying that right, Becky?
Vision zero.
Vision zero,
yeah,
yes.
Yes.
Makes me think about another application of system dynamics, of system science, to really try to study how we can get to zero polio deaths. So there's a whole series of papers that have used simulation to really understand, test different alternatives, and sort of along the path in different geographies to really try to figure out how we can get to zero polio. How can we eradicate polio in a way that is sustainable and the most cost effective. And so their model is really about disease transmission, and our model is emerging, but it's likely to have components of what you've seen. So the sort of vehicle fleet, technology, how that's playing out, miles traveled, where people are driving. So here's a couple of papers to take a look at, but really what they're doing here is trying to think about what are the decision options if we're trying to zero out polio. Our options, our sort of our actions affect risks and conditions which affect the outbreak, okay, and our response to it. And we hope that it's in a way that is going to reduce paralytic cases of polio and healthcare costs, but these decisions affect financial costs. It costs to do a lot of things for disease control and for Vision Zero. And the outbreak, in this case, in our case, crashes have a cost as well. So our intervention, our action has a cost, and there are cost implications of the changes that we make in the system. But we really want to try to start to look at these together. Next slide. In this work, they've got a number of different action ideas that are being debated, and sort of in the absence of having used models, what would have been done is, we might look at sort of the disconnected evidence on any one of these pieces. So, I'm sorry, this is really hard to read, but it's routing immunization options, oh, I can't read this at all. Okay, you can see the slides, but it's really starting, there's a variation in sort of, are we doing surveillance? Are we doing sort of active or passive case detection? Are we doing education to try to make people aware of symptoms or just the importance of vaccination? There's all sorts of, I wanted to put this in just so you could see, there really are a lot of ways that we can get underneath the polio eradication. At the Justice, there are a lot of ways that we could try to get to vision zero or to get these pedestrian fatalities down. And with the use of modeling, we can start to simulate and compare. So test out, not in the real world, in our virtual world, we can start to test out these different interventions and really in a sort of structured way, think about how much are they going to cost, both to implement and in terms of the cost implications of the changes that they trigger, so that we can really build more of a business case for change. And we can start to try to talk about how to get underneath this problem more broadly with all of the relevant stakeholders that really need to be discussing this, rather than just sort of one at a time where people maybe don't feel like they have the resources to try to get underneath this issue. So we want to get to the place where we can really use these simulation models to help people learn, improve their own mental models, but also inform the decisions that they're making about how to improve outcomes. Next slide. All right, so this is my sort of conclusion slide about why I think it's worth investing in system science. This is hard work. It takes a lot to build these sort of models and hypotheses, but I think that this is a really good way to advance our understanding of problems. And I really believe in trying to make these models, these hypotheses, explicit, transparent, so that we, our team, and others can continue to test them, because I think as they get tested and then a new version of them, a better version that's more aligned with the data gets put out there, we all win, because it can help us, it serves as the foundation for better action. So again, I just want to emphasize that I think while this is a lot of work, it is really trying to draw out our mental models and help us develop a shared understanding of complex problems. We are trying to build and test. Essentially, the models are our dynamic hypotheses, our hypotheses about what is it that's producing these trends. And because they're explicit, we can test them. It gets us to think differently about how systems function in terms of these feedback loops, which is going to give us new ideas about action. It helps stakeholders view the larger system. We heard this a lot in our group model building sessions. Folks were often sort of living in one piece of this, and they found it very interesting to see how their piece connected to the whole, or they came in not realizing that they were really connected in such an important way to pedestrian fatalities. So trying to make sure that people see how they are connected is going to perhaps get them more engaged, meaning that we've got more of an army to really try to address, get underneath this pedestrian fatality trend that we want to turn around. Okay, it's a framework for integrating what we know. Nothing like building a model to help us realize what we don't know. In which case we need to go and do more research, more sort of deep dives using the methods that we might have already in our toolbox, the non-systems methods, bring that knowledge back in to this process, and really trying to figure out how we can try out different sort of policies, approaches in the simulated world, and learn about where we are likely to have the most impact. Okay, so next slide. There's just a number of resources here if you would like to learn more. Next slide. But please don't hesitate to get in touch with any of us about this project in process or system science more generally. And if anybody has any questions, I don't know if I left any time for that. I did not. I ended exactly 9:30. If anyone has any questions, I'm happy to stay for a couple more minutes. And thank you very much.
So again, thank you all for being here. Please fill out your reflection sheets. Again, if you do have questions, though, I think Kristen is happy to answer a few. So we'll stick around for a little bit.
So, you talk about data, so I'm wondering how you deal with like their
Is that all the system, or does the system count for that?
Yeah, so either
Cases where. Sometimes start saying 20 seconds.
Right, you need to have.
I think, well, trying to find a
Grid already has like that column say or email or not.
where
You know what?
I'm going to have to get an answer position 0.
No, but that's true. Yeah, I'm making it up.
No, there actually is.
Well, this thing is, you almost need something, I need an explain second.
We want to
30 seconds.
It usually was. There is a kind of quick, but you can work over it for seconds. You give it like that.
The next one, I'm, you know, I'm thinking about how you.
So the first
Right in.
you get hit with the information.
Right.
That's like,
Yeah.
some people, 20 seconds, plenty of time.
Yeah, so we're, I mean,
College students will probably do basketball. Overpopulation, which we can recognize.
They represent a lot.
18 to 50, but then you've got your retirement community.
I don't know if you've seen it yet, so we're going on. We're right up for the roadmap for the CSRS, but addresses safe systems.
Yeah.
We're, I think we're
They
planning on
want
actually
you busy
disseminating.
so there's things.
But yeah, you're right. I think
Yeah.
And that's what you